The storm outside was raging, but the real storm was in my library. Shards of crystal were scattered on the floor next to the portrait of my late wife. I looked at my daughter, Olivia, her eyes empty and lifeless. She threw a glass at you, Olivia. In this very house. She recoiled, not out of fear for me, but out of fear of her husband. You provoked him. My throat tightened. Provoked, she roared. Servants must be obeyed. She called you a lodger. Oh. Olivia looked at me, her eyes cold and cruel, her words like a knife stabbing into my heart. Then you should learn to obey. She thought she had robbed me of my dignity. But she was wrong. That night, I decided I would wait for the perfect opportunity to get my daughter back forever. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? It was, by all accounts, a perfect party. As the owner of a Napa Valley vineyard, I'd hosted my share of them, but this one felt different. This wasn't for a corporate client or a charity gala. This was for Olivia, my Olivia. The late afternoon sun, the color of warm honey, spilled over the Mayacamas mountains, illuminating the rows of Cabernet vines that marched in perfect formation across our land. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, punctuated by the cheerful clinking of glasses and the low hum of happy conversation. I felt a surge of paternal pride so potent it was almost dizzying. My daughter, luminous and laughing, was celebrating her engagement. I was chatting with David, an old partner whose friendship had weathered both sour business deals and the bitter loss of my wife Eleanor years ago. We were reminiscing about a disastrous fishing trip, and I was watching my daughter over his shoulder. She was holding court with a group of her college friends, her head thrown back in a joyous laugh that I hadn't heard often enough lately. She wore a simple, elegant slip dress in a shade of emerald that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes. My pride was a physical thing, a warmth spreading through my chest. Then Julian appeared at her side. He moved with the liquid grace of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin, handsome in that sharp, tailored way that art dealers so often are. He placed a proprietary hand on the small of Olivia's back, leaning in to murmur something in her ear. I saw the laughter catch in her throat. "My dear, your smile is radiant," Julian said, his voice a soft caress that still managed to carry across the stone patio to where I stood. "But this dress is perhaps a little too revealing for a chilly evening in the valley, don't you think?" It was a masterclass in subtle control. The comment was framed as concern, but its intent was clear. It was a public correction designed to diminish. "One." I saw Olivia's smile fade, just slightly at the edges. Instinctively, she tugged at the silk scarf draped around her shoulders, pulling it tighter, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of self-consciousness that hadn't been there moments before. "Oh, I think it's fine," she said, her voice a little quieter now. "Of course it's fine," Julian smiled, but the smile was a cold, polished thing that didn't warm his eyes. He gave her waist a light squeeze, a gesture that looked affectionate but was timed like a punctuation mark to his words. "You look beautiful in anything. I'm just worried you'll be cold." He then glanced in my direction, a polite but defiant nod. It was a look that staked a claim, a silent transmission that said, "She's mine now." The warmth in my chest curdled into a knot of unease. Later, the unease hardened into something colder, sharper. Julian had gathered a small circle of his own friends, men with the same expensive haircuts and easy arrogance. In his hand was the bottle of 2 5-year-old Macallan I had given him earlier that day, a gift meant to welcome him into our family. He poured generous measures for his friends, the amber liquid catching the light of the fairy lights strung in the old oak tree. He raised his glass, not to Olivia, not to the joining of 2 families, but to something else entirely. "To men who know what they want," he declared, his voice ringing with self-satisfaction, "and how to get it." He took a long, slow sip, his eyes sweeping over his small audience, deliberately excluding me from his gaze. It was a breathtaking display of conceit, performed on my terrace, with my whiskey. The fatherly pride I'd felt just an hour before now seemed foolish, a relic from a simpler time. I was witnessing the first cracks in the beautiful facade of my daughter's future, and a vague, formless worry for her began to take root. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, their headlights carving paths through the dark valley. I found Olivia alone by the railing, looking out at the moonlit vines. I approached her gently, my words chosen with care. "Julian seems to care a lot about you," I began, testing the waters. She turned to me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the house lights. "He only wants the best for me, Dad," she replied, and her answer sent a chill down my spine. The words were hers, but the sentiment felt borrowed. It was the kind of justification one makes for behavior they know, deep down, is not quite right. She was already beginning to adopt his way of thinking, to see his control as a form of love. In that moment, I understood the nature of the man my daughter was to marry. Julian is like one of my most perfect, yet difficult vines. Stunning in appearance, but demanding in its own right, and it will strangle anything that grows too close. That evening, I realized my daughter was growing right in its shadow. I knew a direct confrontation would be a mistake. It would only drive her further into his arms, making him the misunderstood hero, and me the overbearing father. To pull someone out of a cult, you can't just rush in and say their leader is a fraud. You have to slowly show them the contradictions, let them see the truth for themselves. My role had changed. I was no longer just a father celebrating a milestone. I was now an observer, a rival. I began to file away the details of the evening, the possessive hand on her waist, the chilling toast, her parroted justification. A plan had not yet taken shape, but its seeds, bitter and resilient, had been sown. I would watch. I would wait. And I would protect my daughter in the only way I could. Silently, patiently, and with the devastating foresight of a father's love. The first few months after the wedding were a study in quiet capitulation. For Olivia's sake, I told myself. For her happiness. Julian and Olivia moved into the main house, and I watched as my home began to feel like a meticulously curated hotel in which I was a long-term guest. It started with small things. An abstract, sterile painting appeared on the wall where a sun-faded photograph of Eleanor and a 5-year-old Olivia used to hang. My worn leather armchair, molded to the shape of my body over 2 decades, was moved to a less prominent corner to make way for a severe-looking Italian sofa that was as uncomfortable as it was expensive. New rules, unspoken but rigidly enforced, materialized. Coasters were mandatory on the antique mahogany coffee table I'd refinished myself. The television was never to be left on in the evenings. Julian preferred the ambiance of curated playlists of minimalist classical music. I accepted it all. I was trying to get along, to cede the ground gracefully. Olivia seemed anxious, caught in the crossfire of this silent domestic war. Just before our Sunday dinner, a tradition I'd held sacred since she was a child, I overheard Julian speaking to her in the hallway. His voice was a low, concerned murmur. "Honey, your dad seems a little sensitive about us being here. Let me handle things tonight, okay? I'll show him how we respect his space." It was a brilliant, preemptive strike, positioning him as the thoughtful peacemaker and casting any objection I might have as the ramblings of a territorial old man. Olivia's silence at the dinner table was not consent. It was the tragic result of being utterly and completely deceived. And so, that Sunday, I found myself a guest at my own table. Julian had seated himself at the head, the position that had been mine for 30 years. He had invited a couple, the Hamiltons, a pair of vapid but wealthy art collectors who hung on his every word. The dining room, which had always felt warm and lived in, now felt like a stage. I was pouring a reserve bottle of my best Cabernet, the one I only opened for special occasions, when Julian began his performance. He smiled at Mr. Hamilton, a gesture of conspiratorial charm. "Arthur is a wonderful man," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "He built all this. But of course, running an estate like this in the modern world requires a different vision. There are difficult decisions to be made." He spoke of my house, my vineyard, the work of my entire life, as if he were discussing a corporate takeover he had just successfully executed. Olivia shifted uncomfortably. "Julian, we're going to help Dad modernize a few things," she began, a desperate attempt to soften the blow. Julian cut her off without even a glance, his focus entirely on his guest. "Exactly. Modernize. For example, we're thinking about turning Arthur's old wine cellar into a contemporary art gallery. Wine is great, but art is the lasting legacy." The wine bottle felt heavy in my hand. He might as well have suggested paving over Eleanor's grave. The cellar wasn't just a place for storage. It was the heart of this house, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Every bottle told a story. Every rack held a memory of a season, a harvest, a moment Eleanor and I had shared. It was our history, aging gracefully in the cool, quiet dark. A cold calm settled over me. "That's an interesting idea, Julian," I said, my voice even, but with an edge of steel I hadn't used in years. "But that wine cellar won't be changed." The air grew thick. The Hamiltons suddenly found the pattern on their plates fascinating. Julian's smile vanished. He turned his head slowly to face me, his expression now one of cold, undisguised command. "We'll talk about this later," he said, his voice low and sharp. Then, with a dismissive flick of his eyes, he delivered the final humiliation. "Now, could you get us some more ice?" "Thanks." He didn't say Arthur. He didn't say Dad. He spoke to me as one would a waiter. "I built this house with my own 2 hands. Every brick, every plank is soaked with my sweat. Now I have to go and get the ice from my own freezer, at the behest of a man whose greatest legacy is his collection of Italian leather shoes." I stood there for a beat too long, feeling the weight of the guests' embarrassment. Their awkwardness was a mirror reflecting my own public degradation, and in their discomfort, I saw Julian's mistake. He had revealed his true colors too soon, too brazenly. He had underestimated me. My patience had not just worn thin, it had snapped. But I knew that an angry outburst would only play into his hands, proving his narrative that I was a sensitive old man resistant to change, so I gave a slight, formal nod. As I walked to the kitchen, the clinking of ice cubes into the silver bucket was the only sound. The repressed anger in my chest was transforming, hardening from a molten rage into something colder, more focused, a determination to act. I realized then that I couldn't fight him head-on. That would only hurt Olivia more. I had to find another way, a more subtle path to expose the rot behind the perfect facade. I was no longer a father trying to keep the peace. I was a man defending his territory, and I would learn the art of the silent, patient war. The storm had been threatening all day, a bruised purple sky pressing down on the valley. Now, as night fell, the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the large windows of the library. Inside, the air was just as charged, thick with a tension that had been building for weeks. The argument, when it finally erupted, was over something laughably small. I had invited David, my old friend, for dinner the following week. I had neglected to consult Julian first. He had cornered me by the fireplace, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Don't you understand?" he began, his voice low but vibrating with rage. "This is my home now. Every decision, no matter how small, must go through me. You're just a tenant, a relic of the past." The sheer audacity of it, to be called a tenant in the house my grandfather built, in the room where I had taught my daughter to read. I felt the familiar spark of anger, but I pushed it down, replacing it with a cold resolve. I rose from my armchair to my full height, meeting his gaze directly. "As long as I live, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "This is my home, and I will invite whomever I want." I had challenged him. I had done what no one else had ever done. I'd said no, and the wall of carefully constructed complacency he had built around himself couldn't take the pressure. It broke. His face contorted, the handsome mask shattering into something ugly and primal. "A servant must be obedient," he roared, the sound seeming to shake the very books on the shelves. In one fluid, violent motion, he snatched a heavy crystal tumbler from the side table, one of a set that had been my father's, and hurled it. I flinched back, a purely instinctual movement. The glass sailed past my head, missing me by inches, and smashed against the wall behind me. The explosion of sound was deafening. It shattered against the gilded frame of Eleanor's portrait, my late wife's serene smile now surrounded by a spider web of cracks in the plaster. Shards of crystal rained down onto the Persian rug. Time seemed to freeze. I don't hear the sound of glass breaking. I only hear my daughter's silence. It was a vacuum, a terrifying absence of sound that was louder than the storm now raging outside. I turned slowly. Olivia was standing in the corner of the room, where she had been a silent observer to the entire exchange. Her hands were pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have stolen her voice. "Olivia?" I asked, my own voice sounding distant, foreign. "Aren't you going to say anything?" I waited for her to run to me, to to scream at him, to do something. But she just stood there, paralyzed. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she made no sound. She didn't move toward her father, the target of the assault. She didn't turn on her husband, the aggressor. She was a statue of fear, trapped in the amber of her own terror. Her silence was more painful than 1,000 shards of glass. It was the sound of a soul being crushed. And I knew in that gut-wrenching moment this fight was no longer about me. This is a rescue. Any last, foolish illusion I held about being able to manage this, to gently guide Olivia back to her senses, was gone, shattered along with the crystal tumbler. My daughter was not just being manipulated, she was a hostage, a victim of a psychological imprisonment so complete it had severed her most basic instincts. I looked from her frozen, tear-streaked face to Julian, who was now breathing heavily, his chest heaving, a triumphant manic gleam in his eyes. He had won. He had demonstrated his power, and his prize was my daughter's utter subjugation. I said nothing more. Words were useless now. I turned my back on both of them, on the wreckage of the room and the wreckage of my family, and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly behind me. The anger that had simmered for months had finally burned away, leaving something else in its place. A deep, profound sadness, and a determination as cold and hard as steel. I have lost my daughter. Now it is my duty to bring her back, whether she wants it or not. The war was no longer silent. The first shot had been fired. Now I would find the ammunition to fire back. The morning after the glass shattered against Eleanor's portrait, I woke with a clarity that was as sharp and cold as the broken shards I had swept up in the dead of night. Anger had been a hot, useless fuel. This new determination was a cold, efficient engine. I knew I couldn't do this alone. My first call was to Jonathan Pierce, a friend from my university days who was now one of the most respected and discreet litigators in San Francisco. We met not in his gleaming downtown office, but for a walk through the Presidio, the fog rolling in off the bay, shrouding our conversation in a damp, gray privacy. I laid it all out, the subtle humiliations, the public corrections, the thrown glass, and the most damning evidence of all my daughter's terrifying silence. Jonathan listened without interruption, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his trench coat. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes. He offered a solution. "You're not looking for a divorce lawyer for your daughter, Arthur," he said, his gaze fixed on the faint outline of the Golden Gate Bridge. "You're looking for a wrecking ball. I know a guy." The guy was named Mike Corrigan, an ex-SFPD detective who now worked as a private investigator. We met a few days later in a quaint, obscure bar in North Beach, the kind of place with dark, wood-paneled walls that had absorbed a century of secrets. Mike was a compact, unassuming man in his 50s, with eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away. "What's the objective?" he asked after I gave him the abridged version. "I don't need evidence to take him to court," I told him, leaning forward. "That would destroy my daughter. I need leverage. I need something that can break his control over her. Something he can't spin or explain away." I thought of Julian's polished, perfect facade. He's an art dealer. His reputation is everything. That's his weakness. Julian's reputation is built on beautiful paintings. I have a feeling that if I scrape away the surface layer of paint, I'll find something rotten and ugly underneath. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. I lived under the same roof as the man I was secretly investigating, playing the part of the slightly dotty, defeated father-in-law. I endured Julian's passive-aggressive comments at dinner, watched him charm guests in my living room, and saw the light in Olivia's eyes dim a little more each day. She moved through the house like a ghost, her smiles strained, her laughter a hollow echo of what it once was. Every polite nod, every forced pleasantry, was an act of supreme self-control, fueled by the knowledge that Mike was out there, digging. Finally, Mike called. We met at the same bar. He slid a thin manila folder across the sticky table. It didn't look like much. "He's very clean, Arthur," Mike began, his voice a low grumble. "No criminal record, no debts, pays his taxes on time. Almost too clean. But there's something interesting about his business model." He explained that Julian had a gift for spotting raw talent. He specializes in dealing in works by emerging artists. He buys their early work cheaply, then uses a network of paid critics and a few friendly auction houses to artificially inflate its value. It's a bubble, but he always cashes out before it pops. Completely legal, but very shady. It fit perfectly. A predator in the gallery, just as he was in my home. Mike turned a page in the file. "And here's the interesting part," he said, tapping a finger on a photograph of a young woman with dark, intense eyes. 3 years ago, he was representing a very talented young painter named Isabella Rossi. She was on the rise, the critics loved her, she was poised to be the next big thing. Then suddenly, she disappeared from the art world. Left the gallery, stopped painting, vanished. No one knows why. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Julian bought her entire back catalog, everything she'd ever painted, for dirt cheap right before she retired. Now, that collection is worth millions. I stared at the woman's face. Isabella Rossi. She looked full of fire and passion, not like someone who would simply walk away from it all. A cold dread, a sickening sense of familiarity crept over me. It was another kind of thrown glass, another kind of terrifying silence. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter anymore. I was fighting for this ghost in a photograph. This new knowledge didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a burden, strengthening my resolve into something unbreakable. I looked up from the photo, my course now clear, my target locked. "Find that girl, Mike," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I want to talk to Isabella Rossi." The drive south along Highway 1 was a pilgrimage of sorts. With every mile that spooled out behind me, the manicured perfection of Napa gave way to the wild, untamed beauty of the coast. I was heading to a sleepy seaside town, the kind of place people go to disappear. The salt-laced air that whipped through my open window felt cleansing, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of my own home. I was a man on a mission, filled with a nervous, hopeful energy, but beneath it was a current of dread. I was about to meet the ghost of my daughter's future. Mike had found Isabella Rossi living a quiet life of self-imposed exile, working as a librarian. He'd approached her carefully, and to his surprise, she had agreed to meet me. We met at a small, unassuming cafe with a weather-beaten sign and a view of the churning Pacific. She was no longer the fiery, radiant artist from the photograph. The woman who sat across from me looked tired, her vibrant energy banked down to a low ember. But as she met my eyes, I saw it a spark of the old resilience, a flicker of a fight that had not been entirely extinguished. I began not by asking questions, but by telling her about Olivia. I told her about my daughter's light, her laughter, and how I was watching it fade under the shadow of a man who claimed to love her. I didn't have to say his name. Isabella listened, her hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea. When I finished, she looked out the window at the gray expanse of the ocean, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "He never yelled. He was worse than that. He destroyed you from the inside." She described the insidious process, and every word was a chilling echo of what I had witnessed with Olivia. He started with compliments. "You're so talented, but you need me to guide you. The art world is cruel." Then came the feedback, always delivered with a concerned smile. "This painting lacks depth, honey. Let me show you." Gradually, I stopped trusting my own instincts. I couldn't pick up a brush without hearing his voice in my head, criticizing, correcting. My own studio, my sanctuary, became a place of anxiety. She turned back to look at me, her eyes sharp with the memory of the betrayal. And then, when I was completely dependent on him, when my confidence was in shreds, he began to destroy me professionally. He told collectors that I was emotionally unstable. He told galleries I was unreliable. He created a prophecy, then made it come true himself. When I finally had a breakdown, when I couldn't paint anymore, he was there, the kind savior, buying up all my work for rock-bottom prices, all in the name of helping an old friend. She let out a small, bitter laugh that held no humor. "He didn't steal my paintings, Arthur. He stole my soul." I sat there, the steam from my coffee swirling between us, and I didn't see a stranger. I saw a reflection of my daughter in 5 years if I didn't do something. I saw the end result of the quiet corrections, the subtle manipulations, the suffocating concern. Isabella's story was a prophecy, and I would be damned if I let it come true. My anger was a white-hot, clarifying flame. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. I now had more than leverage. I had a living, breathing testament to Julian's psychological cruelty. "I'm not going to ask you to testify, or to relive that nightmare in public," I said, my voice firm with a newfound purpose. "But I'm having an event in a few weeks. A charity launch at my home. I'm starting a foundation in my late wife's name, Eleanor's Haven for the Arts, to support young artists who've been derailed. I leaned in, my plan crystallizing as I spoke. Julian and my daughter will be there. All of their friends, the collectors, the critics, his whole world will be there. I just want you to be there. She looked at me, wary. Why? What good would that do? I'm not doing this just for my daughter, Isabella, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. I'm doing this for you. Julian took your career away. I want to help you get it back. This foundation, the first grant, the first solo exhibition we sponsor, will be for you. For the first time, I saw a genuine light in her eyes, a mixture of shock and a hope she had long since buried. I was offering her a stage, not as a victim, but as the artist she was always meant to be. I left the coast with a clear, cold plan in my mind. The foundation's launch party would be my stage. My home would be the theater, and Julian, the master manipulator, would finally be forced to watch a scene he could not direct. The confrontation was coming not with a roar, but with the quiet, devastating power of a story that needed to be told. The most crucial part of the plan was convincing the fox to build his own trap. I approached Julian not as a father-in-law, but as a supplicant. We were in the library, the very room where he had thrown the glass, and I presented the idea of the foundation to him with a carefully constructed air of weary vulnerability. You were right, Julian, I began, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It's time for me to think about my legacy, this place. It's too much for one man. I want to set up a foundation in Eleanor's name. And with your reputation in the art world, your connections, you're the perfect person to help me launch it. His eyes lit up with the proprietary gleam I had come to despise. It was a perfectly baited hook, appealing directly to his vanity and his desire for control. He couldn't possibly refuse the chance to preside over such a prestigious, public-facing event. My legacy, my wife's memory, he would gladly co-opt them both. From that moment on, the planning for the Eleanor's Haven for the Arts inaugural fundraiser became his personal production. A few weeks before the event, he was pacing my living room, a glass of my best Chardonnay in his hand, directing a team of flustered event planners with the authority of a field marshal. No, no, he said, gesturing dismissively towards the west lawn. The stage must be set to the east, facing the valley. The sunset will be the backdrop. I want my speech to be impressive. He spoke as if his speech was the only one that mattered. Olivia, standing beside me, looked worried. A small crease appeared between her brows. "But you'll speak too, right, Dad?" she asked, her voice quiet. Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of warmth. He draped an arm over Olivia's shoulder, a gesture that was both affectionate and confining. "Of course, my dear. Arthur will give a brief welcome speech. But the important speech, the speech about the Foundation's future vision, will of course be mine." He looked directly at me, a challenging, triumphant smile playing on his lips. It's my world, after all. Art. Legacy. He saw a harmless old man, a relic he was graciously allowing to share his stage. He had no idea I had built the stage, written the script, and was about to cue the final devastating scene. Everything is set, the lights, the sound, the actors. Julian thinks he is the star of the play. Little does he know, he is just the villain in someone else's story, and the final act is about to begin. Later that week, I enacted the next part of my plan. I left an old, elegant catalog from one of Isabella Rossi's first exhibitions on the coffee table, tucked partially under a copy of Art Forum. As I'd hoped, Olivia, seeking a moment of quiet, sat down with a cup of tea and picked it up. I watched from my armchair, pretending to be engrossed in a book. "This painting is beautiful," she murmured, tracing the image of a swirling, passionate abstract with her finger. "Isabella Rossi. That name sounds familiar." I looked up, feigning a moment of recollection. "Oh, an old artist Julian used to represent. Very talented girl," I said in a nonchalant, almost absent-minded voice. Such a shame she quit. Julian said she had some personal issues. I let the phrase hang in the air, a drop of poison delivered with a father's gentle hand. I had deliberately reused the exact words Isabella told me he had weaponized against her. I saw the seed land. A flicker of confusion, a nascent suspicion, crossed her face before she smoothed it away. It was a start. My own secret preparations continued. I met with Isabella one last time, not in a cafe, but here at the vineyard, late one evening when Julian and Olivia were in the city. We walked through the empty tent where the party would be held, and I reassured her. She was terrified, but resolute. I also made a call to Catherine Finch, a respected arts journalist I'd known for years, a woman with a reputation for sniffing out the rot beneath the gilded surfaces of the art world. I invited her as my personal guest, promising her a story worth the drive. The night before the party, I walked alone through the vineyard. The rows of vines were dark, silent silhouettes under a canopy of stars. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, a sound like a whispered secret. I felt the immense weight of my gamble. This wasn't just a party, this was a trial. And I was both prosecutor and judge. I was risking the fragile, damaged relationship I had left with my only daughter, and I was placing the future of a brave, broken woman in my hands. But as I stood there, between the earth my family had tilled for generations and the house I had built with my own hands, I knew there was no other choice. The stage was set, the guests were coming, and the truth, after years of being silenced, was about to have its moment in the spotlight. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The evening was perfect, nauseatingly so. Strings of fairy lights twinkled like captured stars between the old oak trees. A jazz trio played softly, their music a sophisticated murmur beneath the chatter of 100 guests. The air smelled of night-blooming jasmine, expensive perfume, and money. Tens of thousands of dollars were being pledged to Eleanor's foundation, and at the center of it all, bathed in a warm, adoring spotlight on the custom-built stage, was Julian. He was magnificent. He was charming, passionate, and utterly convincing. He owned the stage, my stage, and he spoke of the sacred duty of the wealthy to protect the arts. And that's why this foundation is so important, he said, his voice resonating with a carefully practiced sincerity. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the rapt faces of his audience, of my friends. To support young talent, to nurture that fragile flame, to give them a chance that the cruel, capricious art world sometimes takes away, to make sure no talent is ever forgotten. And that was his cue, my cue. As his final hypocritical words hung in the air, a subtle signal from me to the technician in the back brought the stage lights down. The warm spotlight on Julian vanished, plunging him into semi-darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Then, the large screen behind him, which had been displaying the Foundation's tasteful logo, flickered to life. It wasn't a video about our mission. It was a photograph. A stunning gallery-quality portrait of a young woman, her face alive with passion and joy, a paintbrush in her hand. It was Isabella Rossi in her prime. From a microphone at my table, my voice, amplified by speakers throughout the vineyard, cut through the confused silence. It was not angry. It was warm, solemn, and full of purpose. Julian, you said it so beautifully. We must never let a true talent be forgotten. Your words remind me of someone very special. The artist in this photograph. I paused, letting the entire audience, letting Olivia, connect the image to the name I had planted in her mind. It is my profound honor to announce the first official grantee of Eleanor's Haven for the Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in celebrating the return of a singular talent, Isabella Rossi. And then the curtain rises, not with an accusation, but with the presence of a ghost from the past. A spotlight I had positioned earlier sliced through the darkness, illuminating the main path to the tent. And there she was, Isabella. She was no longer the tired librarian from the seaside cafe. She wore a simple, elegant black dress. Her hair was styled, and her eyes, clear and strong, were fixed on the stage. She began to walk forward. A dead silence fell over the vineyard. You could hear the clink of a fork on a distant plate. Julian, who had built his kingdom on her lost career, stood frozen on the stage, a silhouette against the luminous image of his own victim. His face, caught in the reflected light from the screen, was a bloodless mask of shock. This is a surprise, he stammered into the microphone, his voice a strangled whisper. He tried to force a smile, a pathetic attempt to reclaim the narrative. Isabella, it's wonderful to see you. He tried to counterattack, to paint her as unstable. Isabella, I'm so sorry you still feel such bitterness. Everyone, he pleaded to the silent crowd. She is an old, dear friend who has been through some difficult times. But his words were weak, desperate. Isabella didn't even flinch. She reached the stage, walked up the steps, and took the microphone from his limp hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and carried to every corner of the tent. I was surprised too, Julian, she said, her gaze locked on his, especially since the last time we spoke, you told me my career was over, that I was unstable, that I should be grateful you were helping me by buying my entire life's work for pennies on the dollar. She then turned away from him, her back to her tormentor, and faced the crowd. But her eyes found only one person, my daughter, Olivia, sitting in the front row, her face a canvas of dawning, horrified understanding. I'm here tonight to say that no one has the right to decide when your story is over, Isabella said, her voice ringing with the power of a truth finally spoken. And no one ever has the right to extinguish your light just because they want to stand in your shadow. The illusion was not just cracked, it was annihilated. I saw the flash of Catherine Finch's camera. I heard the shocked murmurs erupting through the crowd. But I saw none of it. I only watched my daughter's face. I saw the lie she had been living in crumble around her, and in its place a terrible, devastating clarity. His words, her actions, my warnings, it all coalesced in one moment of pure, undiluted truth. Observing the scene I had so carefully orchestrated, I felt no joy, no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness for my daughter. The villain was exposed, but the price was her broken heart. The final act was over. The stage was now hers. The silence that followed Isabella's final word was more profound than any sound. For a single frozen moment, the 300 guests, the jazz trio, and the night itself seemed to hold their breath. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Then the spell shattered. It began not as a shout, but as a murmur, a ripple of whispers that spread through the crowd like a contagion. Phones, which had been politely stowed away, were suddenly in hand, their screens glowing like tiny, judgmental eyes. People who had been laughing with Julian an hour ago now avoided his gaze, turning to their neighbors with raised eyebrows and hushed, damning questions. His social world, the glittering edifice upon which his entire identity was built, was collapsing in real time. On stage, Julian's face cycled through a series of masks. The initial shock gave way to a flash of pure, murderous rage, followed by the slick, practiced smile of a salesman trying to salvage a deal. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was a king standing on a suddenly empty stage, his castle walls crumbling into dust around him. Beside me, Isabella stood tall, a silent, powerful rebuke to his entire existence. She had said her piece, the rest was just fallout. The exodus began. It was a polite stampede, a retreat disguised by feigned apologies and sudden recollections of babysitters. We really must be going, people murmured, their eyes darting anywhere but at the stage, at me, or at my daughter. Catherine Finch, the journalist, was not leaving. She moved through the departing crowd with the focused grace of a shark sensing blood in the water, her expression a mixture of professional glee and genuine shock. She knew, as I did, that this was more than a scandal. It was a character assassination, executed with surgical precision. Julian finally moved. He stumbled down the stage steps, his movements clumsy, his composure gone. He ignored the departing guests, his eyes scanning wildly until he found Olivia. She was still in her front row seat, as if rooted to the spot, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. He strode to her, grabbed her by the arm, not gently, but with the bruising force of ownership, and pulled her to her feet. We're going inside, he hissed, the words meant only for her, and began towing her toward the house, using her as a human shield against the hundreds of staring eyes. I watched them go. My every instinct screamed at me to intervene, to pull his hand off my daughter. But I held my ground. I had lit the fire. Now I could only hope that it would burn down her prison, and not consume her in the process. Catherine Finch was at my side. "Arthur," she said, her voice low, "that was the single most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed at a Napa fundraiser. Do you have a comment?" I turned to her, my expression one of weary paternal concern. It was not hard to fake. "I have no comment on what just happened, Catherine," I said, my voice measured and calm. "I think Miss Rossi's story, and her courage in telling it, speaks for itself. My only concern now is the Foundation's mission, and, of course, the well-being of my daughter." It was the perfect statement, humane, evasive, and planting a seed of doubt about Julian's character that would now grow into a forest. Inside the house, the grand living room felt cavernous and cold. The muffled sounds of car doors slamming and tires crunching on the gravel driveway were the only connection to the world outside. Julian finally released Olivia's arm, leaving a map of red fingerprints on her skin. He began to pace, his hands tearing through his perfectly styled hair. The sophisticated art dealer was gone, replaced by a cornered, frantic animal. "Did you see what he did?" he spat, his voice a venomous cocktail of panic and rage. "He set me up. Your father, that manipulative old bastard, he set this whole thing up." Olivia said nothing. She stood by the cold fireplace, rubbing her arm, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. She was seeing it all, the subtle digs, the comments about her clothes, the toast to himself, the thrown glass. It was all replaying in her mind. But this time the scenes were illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving light of Isabella's truth. "And that woman," Julian continued, his voice rising to a frantic pitch, "that crazy, unstable woman, she was always a liar. She's just bitter. She just wants money, Olivia. Can't you see that? You have to believe me. You have to trust me. You are my wife." He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm again. "You are my wife." Something in Olivia snapped. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she wrenched her arm from his grasp. The action was so sudden, so decisive, that it stunned him into silence. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, she saw him clearly. Not the charming, confident man she had fallen in love with, but the panicked, ugly creature standing before her now. Her voice, when she spoke, was a tremble, but it was a tremble of fury, not fear. "I saw your face, Julian." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" On the stage, when she walked out, Olivia continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I saw your face. That wasn't the face of a man who was wronged. It wasn't the face of someone who was surprised. It was the face of someone who was caught red-handed. It was her strongest, truest sentence in a year. The mask of his rage fell away, replaced by the desperate, pleading face of a manipulator whose primary tool has just been broken. He softened his voice, his eyes welling with crocodile tears. "Olivia, baby, no, I love you. Everything I have ever done, every single thing, has been for us, for our future. I built this life for us." He took a step closer. "You can't leave me now. Not now. Where would you even go? Back to him? Back to that old man who just proved he will do anything to control you?" She heard the words, "I love you." For us. Control, but they sounded different now. They were the bars of a cage she had only just realized she was in. She didn't know who to trust. Her father had orchestrated this public demolition. Her husband was a liar and a monster. The ground had fallen away beneath her feet. But for the first time in months, she knew she needed to trust the silence, to trust the small, battered voice inside her that was finally screaming to be heard. Without another word, she turned from him. She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his, and ran. Not out the door, not to me, but up the grand, sweeping staircase. Julian called after her, his voice a pathetic wail. "Olivia, don't do this! Olivia!" From outside, where I stood under the cold, indifferent stars, I heard the sound echo through the now quiet house, the slam of her bedroom door, followed by the sharp, definitive click of a lock turning. It wasn't a complete victory. She hadn't run to me, but she hadn't stayed with him either. She had chosen herself. She had chosen a locked door. She had chosen solitude. It was the first step. And as I stood there watching the lights in my house go out one by one, I felt a terrifying, breathtaking hope. I had broken the shackles. Now, I could only pray she had the strength to walk away from them for good. The days that followed the party were a new kind of silent hell. The house was a tomb, heavy with unspoken truths. Olivia remained locked in her room, refusing to see me, refusing to see him. I left trays of food outside her door, which were sometimes, but not always, taken. Julian, stripped of his audience and his power, was a phantom in the halls. He had tried to spin the story to the few friends who would still take his calls, painting himself as the victim of an elaborate vindictive plot orchestrated by a jealous father and a mentally unstable ex-client. No one was buying it. His calls to galleries went unreturned. His invitations were rescinded. He was a social leper. His desperation, I knew, would soon curdle into something dangerous. He had lost everything, and a man with nothing left to lose is the most unpredictable creature on earth. It was on the fourth day that he finally broke through her defenses. I don't know what he said to her through the locked door, what cocktail of threats, pleas, and twisted declarations of love he administered. But that evening, a pale and withdrawn Olivia emerged. She came to me in the library, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling. "Julian wants to talk," she said, her voice a monotone. "All of us. Together. He says you manipulated everyone. He says he can prove it. He wants to have a final, honest talk, to clear the air." My blood ran cold. "Olivia, that's not a good idea." "He said it has to be on neutral ground," she continued, as if reciting a script. "A public place. He suggested the Montgomery Street BART station tomorrow afternoon. He says he'll explain everything, and then we can all move on." It was a trap. A child could see it was a trap. But my daughter, my intelligent, broken daughter, was standing before me, asking me to walk into it. I saw in her eyes a desperate flicker of hope that perhaps Julian was right, that there was a simple explanation that could restore the world she had known. To refuse would be to confirm Julian's narrative that I was the one controlling her, and so I agreed. I had to follow her into the dark one last time to show her the light. The air in the subway station was a chaotic symphony of noise and movement. The screech of arriving trains, the garbled announcements over the PA system, the river of anonymous faces, it was the perfect stage for a final act of violence. We stood on the crowded platform, a tense, isolated island of three. Olivia stood between us, a fragile bridge connecting two warring continents. Julian, to his credit, played his part beautifully. His face was a mask of pained sincerity. "Arthur," he began, his voice pitched just loud enough to be heard over the din, "I know things are bad, horribly bad, but I love Olivia, and I know she loves you. We have to find a way through this. For her," I looked past him, at my daughter. Her eyes were blank, unfocused. She was there, but she wasn't. "There's nothing more to say, Julian," I said, my voice flat. He moved closer, stepping in front of Olivia, shielding her from my view. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that was for my ears alone. "Oh, yes, there is," he hissed, the faux concern evaporating to reveal the pure malice beneath. "There's one last thing to take care of." It happened in a heartbeat. The roar of an approaching train filled the tunnel, a wave of wind rushing ahead of it. In that split second of horror, as his hands slammed into my chest, it felt as if the world, as if they both, had pushed me. But later, looking back, I realized she was just standing there, a statue caught in his play. My body tilted backward, a helpless, horrifying loss of balance. The edge of the platform disappeared. The world became a blur of oncoming lights, the screech of steel on steel, and the terrified faces of strangers. The last thing I saw before I fell was my daughter's face, and on her lips a small, strange smile appeared. It was not a smile of triumph. It was not the smile of a monster. It was the quiet, relieved smile of a prisoner who had just watched their jailer fulfill a promise. Julian had told her he would fix it. He had told her that after this one final terrible thing, the chaos would end, the noise would stop, and they would be at peace. In her shattered, manipulated mind, my death was not a murder. It was a solution. And that smile, that terrible, broken smile, hurt more than the fall, more than the fear of the oncoming train. I landed hard, the impact jarring my bones, in the grimy, recessed well between the tracks. The train roared over me, a deafening, thunderous beast of metal and wind. It was a hurricane of noise and vibration, and the smell of hot oil and ozone. I lay there, pressed into the filth, and I wasn't thinking about my death. I was thinking about my daughter's smile, and I knew I had to live. I had to survive to show her that his peace was a lie, and that her prison was not yet a grave. I had to show her what true freedom looked like. The train passed. A strange ringing silence descended, punctuated by the screams of the people on the platform. I was bruised, battered, and covered in grime, but I was alive. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. I grabbed the edge of the platform and hauled my body out of the pit. When I stood, I did not look at Julian. I looked at Olivia. Her smile was frozen, a grotesque artifact from a moment ago. As she registered my presence alive, standing, breathing, it didn't just fade, it shattered. It cracked and broke apart like a pane of glass, and behind it was a raw, primal horror. The blankness in her eyes was replaced by a tidal wave of pure, undiluted realization. The lie, the final, most monstrous lie, had been exposed in the most undeniable way imaginable. Julian, seeing me, his face a rictus of disbelief, turned to run. But it was Olivia's voice that stopped him. It wasn't a whisper or a tremble. It was a scream. A full-throated, soul-tearing scream that cut through the chaos of the station. "He pushed him!" she shrieked, her arm shooting out, her finger pointing directly at the man she had called her husband. "He pushed my dad!" That was it. That was the rescue. That was the choice. In that moment, she wasn't his victim anymore. She was my witness. She was her own savior. Hands from the crowd grabbed Julian, tackling him to the ground before he could escape. But I barely registered it. I took a step, then another, walking through the parted sea of onlookers. I walked toward my daughter. Her face was a ruin of tears and shock, her body shaking uncontrollably. But as I drew closer, I saw something in her horrified eyes that I hadn't seen in a very long time. I saw my daughter. My battle was over. Hers was just beginning. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? Getting my daughter back wasn't a single explosive moment. It didn't happen on a dirty, chaotic subway platform under the flickering glare of fluorescent lights. That was merely the end of the war, the moment the guns fell silent. The beginning of the peace, I came to understand, was a much quieter, slower, and more profoundly difficult process. It unfolded not on a public stage, but in the hushed, confidential stillness of a therapist's office. It involved no applause, only the silent acknowledgement of shared tears and, after many months, a hesitant hand finally reaching across the space between two chairs. The legal aftermath was a swift and brutal affair. Julian's carefully constructed world, already fractured, was systematically dismantled by the state. Olivia's testimony, delivered with a fragile but unwavering strength that made my heart ache with pride, was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. She recounted the subtle manipulations, the escalating control, and the final horrifying moments on the platform with a clarity that left no room for doubt. When Isabella Rossi took the stand, calm and resolute, and detailed Julian's methodical destruction of her career, it painted a damning portrait of a predator. Faced with two credible, powerful women and a mountain of financial evidence Mike Corrigan had unearthed, Julian's defense crumbled. He was convicted of attempted murder and a raft of fraud charges. The man obsessed with legacy and image would have won, but it would be written in the cold, unforgiving language of court dockets and prison records. But that was his story, a chapter slammed shut. Ours was a book that needed to be carefully, painstakingly rewritten. In the immediate, shell-shocked weeks that followed the trial, Olivia moved out. She found a small, characterless apartment in the city, a sanctuary of blank walls and untainted air where no memory of Julian or of me, her flawed rescuer, could reach her. It was a move that sliced through me with the pain of her absence, yet simultaneously filled me with a profound sense of hope. She was drawing her own boundaries, building her own four walls. She had to escape the shadow of the vineyard, the weight of my presence, to find out who she was when no one was trying to save or control her. Months passed. The silence between us was vast and heavy. Then one day she called. She didn't want to talk, not really. She wanted to walk. So we walked. For weeks that turned into seasons. That was how we communicated. We walked through the vineyard in the cool, damp fog of early mornings, our footsteps the only sound. We walked in the golden light of late afternoons, the long shadows of the vines stretching towards us. We spoke of the weather, of the soil, of the impending harvest, trivialities, but the real conversation was happening in the shared space between us. in the comfortable rhythm of our steps, in the slow, gradual rebuilding of trust without the crushing burden of words. I learned the art of patience, of not pushing, of simply being present. The day we were finally able to truly speak came in a beige, anonymous room with two comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on a table between them. It was a neutral space, a safe harbor brokered by a kind, patient therapist who guided us through the treacherous waters of the past. Olivia spoke first, her gaze fixed on her own hands, which were twisting a damp tissue in her lap. Her voice was thin, but it was clear. "I still don't understand it," she whispered, the words she'd clearly rehearsed in her mind 100 times. The smile. I see it in my nightmares. It's like watching a stranger wear my face. Why was I smiling? There's a part of me that looks back at that moment and just loathes myself. I looked at my daughter, at the profound chasm of pain and self-recrimination she was trapped in, and I felt a love so fierce it was a physical ache in my chest. "You weren't smiling, Olivia," I said softly, my voice devoid of judgment. "That wasn't you. That was a character he had written, a role he had forced you to play for so long that you forgot where you ended and the performance began. He spent months convincing you that the chaos, the pain, the conflict, it was all my fault. He promised you an end to it all. He promised you peace. And for one insane, broken second, your mind, which he had so carefully poisoned, believed that was what peace looked like. It wasn't your fault." She finally looked up from her hands, her eyes swimming with tears, but also with a new, challenging fire I hadn't seen since before Julian. "But you saw it," she said, her voice cracking, the accusation raw and honest. "You saw what he was doing to me long before the party, and you made a choice. You threw that party. You used Isabella. You used me. You put my pain on a stage for everyone to see. You used me to fight your war." The truth of her words landed between us, heavy and undeniable. She was right. I had seen her as a victim to be rescued, not as a person with her own agency, however compromised. "Yes," I admitted, the word tasting of ashes and regret. "I did. I was a desperate man watching his daughter disappear into a fog, and I thought the only way to save you was to set the whole forest on fire. I saw it as a war, and I used the weapons I had. And in doing that, I caused you a different kind of pain, a public humiliation that I will never be able to fully apologize for." I leaned forward not to touch her, but to close the distance. I held out my hand, palm up, an open and simple invitation. He forced a choice on you, a choice that was never really yours to make. And now, you can make a different one. Every day, starting today, you can choose how we go forward, and you don't have to do it alone. It took another year, a year of quiet talks, of difficult therapy sessions, of slowly, carefully learning to be father and daughter again, not as we were, but as we were now, two survivors of the same shipwreck, which is where we are now. It is a bright, clear morning in early spring, 2 full years after the party. We are in Eleanor's old rose garden, a corner of the property that had become overgrown with weeds and sorrow. Together, we are bringing it back to life. My hands, stained with soil, are clearing a space for a new David Austin rosebush. Olivia is beside me, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully, expertly, snips a dead branch from a gnarled old climber. The silence between us now is easy, filled not with unspoken trauma, but with shared purpose. It's the silence of companionship. "This vineyard," Olivia says, her voice thoughtful as she straightens up and looks out over the valley, gleaming green in the morning Sunday. "It's been through a lot." I stop my work, looking at her, at the woman she has become. The haunted, hollowed look is gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, resilient strength I recognize as entirely her own. She is scarred, yes, we both are, but she is whole. The legacy I wanted to build, the one I was so afraid of losing, I say, my voice thick with an emotion I no longer have to hide. It was never this vineyard, Olivia. It wasn't the wine or the land. It was you. And nothing and no one can ever destroy that. She turns to me, and a small, genuine smile graces her lips. It holds no shadows, no ghosts from a subway platform. It is just a smile. Her smile. She turns back to her roses, and I turn back to the earth. The sun is warm on our backs. The storm has passed, and here in the quiet morning light, surrounded by the promise of new blooms, we are planting something new. We are beginning again.